So here are possible alternatives, some of which you discussed at your tables. One of these is that this whole idea was fabricated later on in church history. Did anyone talk about that? Maybe this table over here? I thought I heard something go along like that. This is the idea proposed by Dan Brown, for instance, the Da Vinci Code and some later novels that attribute a lot to the Council of Nicaea in 385 AD, where all the Christian bishops got together and supposedly voted on a bunch of stuff that established Christianity. What they did not vote on was whether Jesus rose from the dead or not. That was a pretty well established fact by then. But it's a popular idea that there were lots of different stories floating around about Jesus, and that the church in the 4th century, now having come into legitimacy because Constantine said we're not going to persecute the Christians anymore, decided that we want to only keep documents that agree with our point of view. And so they gathered together Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as the authoritative witness for Jesus, and they tried to get rid of everything else that had other stories about what Jesus was doing. And this is how things started. Well, remember when I pointed out the letters of Paul? That notion is, I think, refuted pretty handily by the fact that 1 Corinthians 15 shows that Paul and others that he'd gotten information from, and a lot of people in the early church, were asserting that Jesus physically rose from the dead a mere 20 years after the event. So this, nice try, Dan Brown, but it doesn't fit with the facts. Oops. Something similar to that is that this was a legend that developed over time. You know that Jesus was a nice moral teacher, and he died, and there wasn't anything remarkable about it, except there were a lot of people upset. But over time, some stories became embellished, and his life and death and aftermath and teaching took on kind of a larger-than-life aspect to them. And so by the time you get, a couple hundred years out, you have this divine teacher, the legend, as it grew. Well, we see evidence from the letters of the apostles, at least, that there wasn't enough time for that kind of legend to develop. You need generations, multiple generations of people. And at the time that Paul was writing his letters, witnesses were still around that could refute or corroborate a lot of what he was saying. In fact, he appealed to them. He said there are 500 people that saw him resurrected. You can go talk to them. So legend won't work. Now here's an interesting one. If the apostles were lying, they had gotten together and said, we can't let this movement die out. What Jesus taught was too important to let die out. We got to keep it going. And the best way to keep it going is to steal the body, maybe, or at least come up with some stories about how it's missing, attributing a resurrection to Jesus.
When it comes to the resurrection of Jesus Christ, here's a question for you. Did the disciples lie about it?
That's one of the things I actually assumed before I started working cold cases. I had a lot of doubt. I was a skeptic. I was not a believer until I was 35. And the issue about whether they lied, I think, was resolved for me as I began to work conspiracies myself. So I understand now what is required for a successful conspiracy. And typically there are 5 things that are required. First thing is the lowest number of conspirators. The lower the number, the less chance someone's going to give it up. Also, the best possible communication between conspirators. If I separate 2 conspirators and I lie to one, one, and the other person doesn't know what I've lied about or what they've said in return to me, it's hard to hold the conspiracy together. Close family relationships are also important. If you've got a son and a mom involved, no one's going to want to talk to you at all, probably because you're too close to each other to want to get involved in that. Low pressure, very low pressure on a conspiracy is very, very important. As you look at the elements of conspiracies, I don't see any of these present in the 12. Way too many conspirators, separated by thousands of miles without any way to communicate back and forth to one another, under incredibly high, like 24 kind of pressure, you see, no way I can see them holding up, especially when I don't think they're properly motivated. Let me explain that. Motivation really comes down to, why would I lie? Yeah. Why would I do anything I shouldn't do? Why do I commit a murder? It's always the same three motivations that I see working these kinds of cases. It always comes down to money, sex, or power. If I'm trying to gain something in one of those three areas, I'm motivated to do something I should not do. I would simply want to know, what is the alleged motivation for the disciples? Did they gain something in any of these three areas that would have motivated them to give up their lives for something they knew wasn't true? And we have no other ancient record related to the 12 other than them being martyred for what they said they believed, or they said they saw happen to Jesus. So I think those two things, lack of motive and the lack of the elements of a true successful conspiracy, lead me to say, was it possible? Anything's possible, it's just not reasonable.
Very compelling.
Well, we have examples of people dying for their faith. Just because somebody dies for their faith isn't very compelling. We have men who flew airplanes into buildings because they were convinced that that this was a good thing for them to do. But that's not what J. Warner Wallace was talking about. He was talking about the disciples going out on that limb and dying and being persecuted for something that they knew was false. That's a key distinction. Something that they knew was false, that they were lying, that they were in a conspiracy with each other to protect. That's what they were allegedly being persecuted and dying for. And would that hold up? Would they reasonably continue to sustain that story for decades under that kind of persecution when they knew it was false? Okay, here's another one. Maybe they weren't lying, but maybe they were sincerely deluded. They were fooled into thinking that Jesus rose from the dead. Now, how could they be fooled? Well, a couple of different ways. One is that Jesus didn't actually die. Now, this is back when I was in high school. There was a book that came out called The Passover Plot. And it was a conspiracy theory that involved Jesus not dying, but the disciples not really knowing that fact. And it was Joseph of Arimathea and somebody else that had this plot together where they got Jesus, they drugged him so he looked like he was dead. They put him in Joseph's tomb, and then they took the body away while he was, barely able to continue to survive. They showed him to the disciples. Hey, he's alive. They said, oh no, he's still alive, and then they whisked him away, and this fooled the disciples into thinking that he had been resurrected. Well, interesting story. And I was actually a bit bothered by that when I was in high school, because I'd never heard any alternative theories before. But is that a reasonable explanation? Is it reasonable to think that Jesus didn't actually die on the cross? It just looked like he did? Well, let's see what an expert has to say.
But is it possible that Jesus never really died on the cross?
When I was studying ancient history at school, I remember one of my teachers saying to me, you have to remember that when you're dealing with the Romans, if you think of the nastiest motive you can imagine, that's probably the right one. Of course, that's cynical. There were nice Romans, there were Romans with a social conscience, etc., etc. But one of the things the Romans were famous for right around the known world was their military efficiency, and one of the things that soldiers characteristically do is to kill people. The Romans were professional killers. That was what they did for a living, those soldiers. And the soldiers at the foot of the cross, if they had for a moment suspected that Jesus was still alive, they had all sorts of interesting and nasty ways of making sure that people were dead.
Well, some people have tried to come up with a theory called the swoon fit theory, the idea that Jesus didn't actually die, the Romans didn't actually kill him, but he looked as if he was dead and he was placed in the tomb and then he revived. I think this would take a lot of credulity to believe. The Romans were absolute masters at execution. They knew how to kill people. And the accounts of Jesus' death indicate very strongly that he had been killed. For example, the separation of what appeared to be blood and water from his side after he died is an indication, a strong indication that he was actually dead by an eyewitness who didn't know that that was a medical proof of death at the time.
Interestingly, John, in his Gospel, says that they were surprised that he appeared to be dead, and so they thrust a spear into his side, and then that extraordinary detail that there came out blood and water, because the vital liquids had already separated out. Jesus had already been dead long enough for that to happen. That sort of eyewitness touch makes it quite clear. But if you don't think that that is sufficiently convincing, then frankly, even a small amount of knowledge of what a Roman centurion was good at and was paid for and was proud of being able to do will tell you that there is no way on earth that they would have let a still half alive Jesus be taken down from the cross.
Today it's very interesting that virtually no scholars, people who are well trained in the field, terminal degrees, responsible teaching positions, peer-reviewed publications, whatever their spectrum, left, right, center, virtually never does anyone question the facticity of the death of Jesus. In fact, John Dominic Crossan of the Jesus Seminar, Marcus Borg of the Jesus Seminar, they both say independently that the crucifixion is about the best attested event in the ancient world. I mean, that's pretty incredible, best attested event.
The crucifixion of Jesus is the one fact about Jesus of Nazareth that is universally recognized by historians, liberal or conservative, Christian or non-Christian. The crucifixion of Jesus is so indisputably established that it is an anchor point for understanding who the historical Jesus was.
No serious scholar today thinks that Jesus survived being crucified. The Roman soldiers knew how to make sure that someone was dead. And even if, against all the odds, Jesus had survived, his followers wouldn't have mistaken his injured body for someone who'd risen from the dead.
A group of people that do not believe that Jesus died on the cross. Those are the Muslims. So the Muslims do not believe that Jesus died on the cross. They think that somebody died on the cross, but it wasn't Jesus. That somehow he got swapped beforehand, and it looked like him, but it wasn't him. And that's how they deal with the incompatibility in their mind of this revered, holy man who they regard Jesus as, a revered prophet who had the favor of God. They can't imagine how God would let that happen, crucifixion, to someone like Jesus. And so their explanation is that it wasn't him, it was somebody else. One of the candidates is Judas, Judas Iscariot, that somehow there was some kind of swap that was done. It was actually Judas that died on the cross. But interesting. Of course, there's no evidence for that, but it is a story that a lot of people hold and believe. So another possibility on the disciples were fooled is that they claimed that they had experiences with the risen Christ. That's undisputed, that these claims were being made. Why were those claims made? One is the idea of mass hallucination. So let's go to our experts again.
Dr. Habermas, some people would say that Jesus didn't rise from the dead. Rather, people were delusional or they were hallucinating. How would you respond to that?
Well, the problem is going to be that we know that Jesus appeared to groups of people. Critics allow that. He appears to groups. There's no documented cases of hallucinations to groups of people. That's a huge issue. The hallucination theory is what I'd call a full tomb theory. But we have 23 evidences for the empty tomb. If it's an empty tomb theory, you have to go bark up another tree because hallucinations don't even work. It doesn't account for why the body's out of the tomb. Now you have to have another theory. Paul and James, two unbelievers, until they met the risen Jesus, they wouldn't be in a frame of mind to hallucinate. So what are we going to do with them? The fact, probably I haven't even mentioned the biggest objection, and that is that the resurrection appearances happened at too many different times, too many different places, too many different people. Every time you have an hallucination, it's personality related. So every time you bring people into it, the more you have, men, women, outdoors, indoors, standing, sitting, walking, talking, every time you introduce a factor like that, you decrease the likelihood of everybody having an hallucination. The fact that Jesus changed venues all the time makes this a huge problem. So for all these reasons, critics don't have very many things to choose from, so it remains a popular view, but probably no theory, no hypothesis against the resurrection has more refutations.
This last one, twin brother, this is actually proposed by a professor at Cal State Irvine many years ago in a debate that I thought was a very creative attempt to deal with this. That Jesus actually had a twin brother that nobody knew about. One of them was executed on the cross, and the other one was presented as the risen thing. Yeah. So what? I wonder what Mary thought of that theory. That she didn't even know that Jesus had a twin brother. And here's a popular one nowadays also, and that is that when the New Testament Gospels talk about resurrection, it's really a spiritual resurrection. It's not a physical resurrection. It's the rising of the Christ consciousness in everyone that we celebrate on Easter Sunday. That sounds very, very nice and religious and spiritual. It's not biblical. I think when you honestly examine the biblical accounts, all of them, you can't deny the idea that they are presenting a physical resurrection. John 20, Jesus says, "Put your finger here in my hand and your hand in my side." He was offering that as evidence to Thomas that he was physically there. He wasn't just an apparition. He wasn't a ghost. He wasn't a hologram. We see Jesus eating, with his disciples after he rose from the dead. So anyway, nice try, but doesn't comport with the biblical facts. So here's my little diagram on where we've gone. We've had legend, liars, that the disciples were fooled. Somehow there was a plot in which he appeared to be dead, but then he got all patched up. Hallucination, twin brother, lots of attempts. But they all seem to have flaws. If I were presenting this before a jury and you were on the jury panel, would you fall for any of these alternative theories? It seems hard for me to swallow. And this just some shorthand notations of that. So this is the question: is it reasonable to think that Jesus actually did rise from the dead? We've got a lot of evidence that supports that, but not everyone's going to be convinced. And why is that? And here's an example of one skeptic.
I would say that there are those three established facts, which...
They're not established facts. I'm sorry, they are repetitions of what is written in the Bible.
Well, insofar as you say that, Dr. Atkins, you disagree with the majority of New Testament historians who say that these facts do belong to the portrait of the historical Jesus.
But most of the historians of the New Testament are believers themselves and are desperate for it to be true, and they make it true by assertion.
I think that's a very naive view of New Testament criticism.
They certainly cannot prove that it is true.
Not in the sense of a mathematical proof, but in the sense of a historical proof.
Can we prove that Caesar was killed?
Well, exactly. It's the same sort of
proof we're talking about. It's not that there were real witnesses to Caesar's death. And on the day that it happened, there were no witnesses that
on the day that it happened,
what happened. on the day that Jesus purported to die.
Now, you're not denying that the crucifixion of Jesus was therefore a historical fact, are you?
It's quite likely he was crucified, at least someone was.
Yes, okay. And now, was he then buried by Joseph of Arimathea, as the Gospels report?
Well, that's what they wrote 80 years later, but I can't remember
Not 80
who
years.
buried my mother.
Uh-huh.
Well, maybe there was no reason to memorialize that burial.
I think it's important to understand that the New Testament critics who look at the New Testament are not, as you say, these biased believers desperate to believe in this. German New Testament criticism, which I have done my doctoral work in, is enormously skeptical and enormously influenced by the same anti-miraculous presuppositions that you evinced. And yet, the majority of critics today have found themselves driven to accept the facts of the empty tomb, the appearances of Jesus.
And the appearances of, there were 87,000 appearances of Elvis last year, weren't there?
I don't think that...
Princess Di, I mean,
yes.
Princess Diana is going to be the next person to be...
No, wait, but now are you admitting, though, now that they did have these experiences of appearances, but that they were hallucinations?
I can believe that there are two possibilities. One is that they were hallucinations, that they really so missed their leader that they were desperate to see him, and they just invented this.
This strikes you as extremely clear. Why doesn't it strike other people as extremely
Well,
clear?
as I say, I think some folks have an antipathy toward
Like his?
theism, like Dr. Atkins. I mean, it's so evident that he's got his mind made up when he said, what are the possibilities for explaining these resurrection appearances? The possibilities were lying or hallucinating. There wasn't even a possibility that they were telling the truth, that God really had done this. In other words, it's ruled out in advance.
Well, I think it's so unlikely that anything like that could happen that you have to look at the simpler explanations first. Go for the simpler explanation. Only if the simpler explanation fails and is explicitly shown to fail, go to the more complicated one.
I agree entirely with that.
And the breakdown of the laws of nature by the intrusion of the finger of God is not a simple way of proceeding.
That you're misusing the criterion of simplicity. That's not what simplicity means. It means don't multiply causes beyond necessity. And in this case, the hypothesis that these men were lying or were hallucinating is simply implausible, given their willingness to die for their beliefs, which shows sincerity, and given the un-Jewish nature of the belief that they came to hold, which couldn't have been the product of their own imaginations.
People go for a living death by throwing themselves into nunneries and into monasteries.
But they believe that it's true.
They believe it's true, but they're wasting their lives because of it.
But the point is that they really sincerely believe it. They're not lying. And that was the point that was being made here before.
So these 12 fishermen also believed it.
Okay, so you're willing to admit they weren't lying.
I can accept that if it is true, then it is possible that they were not lying.
Okay, so then
these were simple-minded people. They were surrounded by miraculous events said to be going on. Maybe they just wanted to join in for the notoriety of being involved in amazing events.
But
there were people who were bored.
You think that
there wasn't much to do in Palestine at the time.
So they invented the resurrection of Jesus and endangered their lives because they were bored?
Well,
Okay, so we're coming into port now. The actual resurrection of Jesus seems to fit best the historical facts, but it requires the possibility of miracle, which Peter Atkins was not willing to acknowledge. But given weeks 1 through 3, miracle is not an implausible thing. We do have evidence that it's reasonable to conclude that there's a creator that is involved with his creation. Therefore, the Christian has good reasons to believe that Jesus rose from the dead, with all of its ramifications. Now, that last sentence, I think, is worth at least thinking about as we go out of here. The implications of Jesus' resurrection. It substantiates his claims of divinity and authority. It confirms his effective work on the cross. It roots the claims and teachings of Christianity in history rather than just somebody's good ideas. Sermon on the Mount, you know, the nice Jesus with lambs and children. It confirms that Jesus is alive today. Think about that. You know, we were wondering where he went on his resurrection, on his ascension. Well, he hasn't gone away. Jesus is alive today. And I think the final conclusion is I ought to submit to his authority and trust in his grace. Those are the implications of Jesus rising from the dead, if in fact that took place. So, what does trust in Jesus look like? We don't have time for discussion, but I want you to think about it. Okay? So the implication is if it did happen, I need to trust him. What does that trust look like? And hearkening back to the very first week, this is not trust. Remember this diagram? We can know everything there is to know about how an airplane works, but until I actually get on the airplane and allow it to take me someplace, I'm not trusting. So think about what trust in Jesus looks like for your life.